had been around wrestling in one way or another for a while now, going back to England where you were a second for Chris. But now you're in front of a camera. Now you're doing these interviews, these Joan Collins interviews, if I may say.
Yeah.
Was it nerve-wracking, or did you feel like you were able to just naturally go out there and perform as a, as a heel doing interviews?
I think, if I'm honest, I was always nervous. And Chris was pretty much, we'd talk about it. He'd say, say this and say that. But there's something to be said when you've got the camera and it's live and it's not edited. You just go with the flow of it. And there was a lot of people there too that were supportive of me. But yeah, I was really nervous. But when it push come to shove, I pulled it off, I think. If everybody hated me, I was a really bitch slut. And I was obviously had to take that as a compliment, The crowd in the Sportatorium were great. It had such an atmosphere in there. It was electric. I loved the Sportatorium, and so sad. I said to one of my friends in Dallas, if I get back to Dallas, I'd love to come and just visit the Sportatorium. And I actually saw a DVD, I think, with Kevin, where he went back there. And I felt really, goosebumps. I felt it was really haunting to see the place, come down. I just have such good memories. Percy was someone I was really close to. And, it just had a real electric atmosphere to it. And the fans, they were just great. You'd see the same fans in the same seats. And just sad, really, that it's not there anymore.
Yeah, I believe you're speaking about the Heroes of World Class documentary, which is an incredible film. It really is. They did a great job with it.
It is. Yeah.
On that topic, we mentioned earlier, Kevin Von Erich wrote the foreword to your book. You're in Dallas from 85 on. You're there when Mike Von Erich has his tragedy and Kerry's still around. What memories do you have of the Von Erichs, and what were they like behind the scenes?
Well, I wasn't around when David died. I think that I might have been in Florida then. When I did know Kerry, again, I'd gone to a few radio. I can't remember what they were, but there was like a party or something going on, and he'd always ask me for like cocaine and stuff like that. So I knew he had a problem, but I was amazed how, how he wrestled when some people say he had his foot amputated. And I mean, I can't hardly believe how he managed, but I always found him to be really nice to me. I didn't know him that well,
Did you ever meet Fritz?
No, never. Never got to meet him, not once. See, I think Joey was there when I was there, and I only sort of periodically went to the Sportatorium as a guest of Chris, maybe like twice in the whole year. So I didn't see Fritz at all, no.
And one other name I want to ask you about, who was aligned with that office for many years on and off, and did some stuff with Chris as well, is Gary Hart. Did you ever meet Gary?
Oh yeah, many, many times.
What was he like?
Many times. I thought he was brilliant, just really clever. He'd often invite us over. Tony and I would often go over to his apartment. And I just thought he was really smart and clever, and, he very, very, very nice person, I thought.
The feud goes on for a while, and eventually it ends, and Steve gets an opportunity to work for the territory based out of Memphis for Jerry Jarrett, the other end of the territory now that he had purchased the Dallas territory. And around this time, something happens that, we'd always heard rumors, but I'd never actually seen something in print just saying what it was, that breaks up the relationship between Steve and Chris Adams. And the story is, and correct me where I'm wrong, Steve was booked on a show in the Dallas area, and he took the booking. And Chris was upset because it was a show against a show he was running. So he told Steve to work for him. He would pay him the same amount of money and gave him a guilt trip. I'm the guy who trained you. Come work for me. Steve felt obligated to do that. He canceled the other booking, was very apologetic, went to work for Chris. And instead of the $100 he was guaranteed, he got $40, and he never forgave Chris for that. Is that the correct retelling of the story?
Yeah. I mean, because Steve took the job with I think his name was Watts, Ed Watts or something. I don't quite remember, I'm not sure. And he was guaranteed 100, and, Chris did say to him, he promised, and bearing in mind at that time, that was a lot of money for Steve, because that meant he could put gas in his car and get a hamburger, because he was poor, very, and so $60 was a massive amount of money to him at that time. But it was Chris's attitude to Steve, because Steve did call him up and he said to him, hey, you've only given me 40 and you promised me 100. And Chris kind of said, who do you think you're talking to, and he ended up hanging the phone up on Steve. And that really pissed Steve off. And he didn't really ever like Chris that much after that.
Do you think there's anything Chris could have done after that to repair the relationship, or was it just that was it?
That was it, because Chris did try, because when we were living out in Atlanta, Chris was coming through that area, I think to see his brother, to be honest, because the Olympics were on in that area. I think that's the reason. And I said to Chris, yeah, come on by the house, because he could see Jade. And Chris was really, really trying, but Steve got that grudge, I think, if I'm right. He didn't really forgive Chris, but I think Chris would have liked to have tried to mend it, but I think a lot of people got mad at Chris because one of the things he did was if he put his own promotions, I think there was an incident out in Puerto Rico where Rick Rude was really angry at Chris because, he promised the guys all this money and then something didn't happen and they didn't make much money, and then Chris didn't pay them. So it wasn't just Steve. There were a few people that were angry at Chris for not keeping his word on the payoffs. But Steve just took that as a real slight and changed everything between their relationship.
Yeah, and I believe you point out in the book, again, the book is Through the Shattered Glass, and I encourage all the listeners to pick it up. You point out that Chris actually, I guess, had an opportunity to work for WCW around that time, and Steve kind of put the word in not to do it. I mean, he was pitching, I guess, the same angle of you being his ex-wife, and he would come in and feud with Steve over that, correct?
Yeah, I was actually there when Dusty was talking about it, because what happened was Chris had spoke to me on the phone, and he said, well, hopefully, because that angle was meant to last a year and it got shut down before we really finished it. And so Chris thought it'd be a good idea to come into WCW and work again as the angle. And Dusty was actually quite interested. And Dusty came up to Steve and I in the back of the dressing room, and he goes, hey, he said, I was thinking about this bringing in Chris Adams. And I was like, yes, because I didn't do as well without Chris's direction, because Chris really helped me. And Steve just said, no, I'm not doing it. So he shut that down. Yeah, that's true.
And what are your thoughts on all that? I mean, do you wish that he had given Chris a chance? Did you ever speak to him about this?
I didn't speak to Dusty, but yes, I would have Chris to have that chance to come in, because I always felt, Chris actually encouraged Jerry to help Steve out, and there was I felt like Chris created this angle. I mean, he was the one behind everything, and I felt like Chris should have an opportunity to come in, if I'm honest. Yeah, I was disappointed that he didn't come in.
So now it's 1991. Steve, after working for a long time, making very little money, the joke is commonly heard where Jerry Jarrett had a meeting and he said he wanted all of his wrestlers off steroids, and Dutch Mantel said, how can we be on steroids? We're not even on food. because they couldn't afford anything there.
Yeah.
But Steve's in WCW, and this is really his big break, his big chance. He's not that he's making giant amount of money right away, but he's on national television. He's making more than he did. And there's an upward momentum to his career now. And of course, he debuts with a valet, Vivacious Veronica. Where did they find her, and what's the story behind that?
Well, I don't know. I'll tell you why, because when Steve did those first tapings, I was in Dallas still running my business, and I didn't see that he was with a valet. Basically, what happened was Magnum phoned my house for Steve, and we just started talking, and he said, "Oh, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I used to work with Steve in World Class, and I'm running a telegram business." He says, "Let's see some tapes of your work." So the next thing is, I think Steve tells me later that, that Dusty and Magnum wasn't happy with Veronica. I can't make a comment on it because I never saw her, met her, or saw her work, so I don't actually know where she came from or why they got rid of her. But I do know that they thought she didn't have good chemistry with him, is what I was told.
And certainly, I don't think she did. And of course, the chemistry would be nowhere near the chemistry that would be there when you showed up as Lady Blossom. What was your thought when you first heard the name Lady Blossom?
Hated it. And so did Steve. And I often, thought, oh no. And I asked if I could change it, and he said no. So, but I said, Steve, I hate it. And he goes, yeah, it's not that great, is it? So, but later on, not right before, I don't know who told me, but someone said he thought my chest was blossoming out of my dress, and that's where he came up with that name. I just wish I had something prepared to say, oh, I like this or something, and I didn't. So, but I got stuck with it anyway.
Dusty's the booker there, and I'd like to get your thoughts on Dusty. But before I get there, did you have any run-ins or any conversations, or, what was the general consensus about Jim Herd, who was still running the company at that point?
Actually, I don't know. I don't remember anybody mentioning Jim Herd to me, and I don't recall really meeting him. So that's somebody I don't recall.
Okay, and what about Dusty? What was Dusty like to work for?
I really liked Dusty, and he would always think I'd hurt myself, and he'd always, after the match, he'd always be like, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" Because they had me taking bumps, and I was just selling it really, like my leg or something. Or he always used to say to me, "Damn, you need to stop pulling your skirt down," because every time somebody would do something to me, I would always tug on my dress, not knowing I was doing it, sort of subconsciously, because I didn't want my underwear to show. So he'd say to me, "You got to stop doing that," and he'd always think that I really got hurt, and I didn't. But he is very, very nice to me.
And while you were there were probably more women on the roster than at any other time in WCW's history to that point. There was you, there was Alexandra York, there was Missy Hyatt, and Medusa would later come in. What was the camaraderie like amongst you women?
Well, it was good for me, and bearing in mind, I really get along with people really well. But I knew Missy because I knew her from World Class, not when I worked, but I knew her via Chris, really, and just being around. So Missy I knew. And to be honest, she was lovely. She'd say to me, "I'll help you out." And Missy and I would go to her apartment. She'd say to me, I'll show you where the hairdressers are and this and that. So I always got along well with her. And Terry and we had our pregnancies fairly close together. So I remember the most about Terry is we would talk baby stuff, because baby, I was pregnant with Stephanie, and, she would ask me things about babies, and Dakota, her daughter, would come over to my house and Steve's house, and we would have her play with Stephanie. So the main thing I remember about Terry is that not so much being around the wrestling as talk. We were both mums, and we hung out with the kids. Medusa came in as I was going out. The thing is I was pregnant, and the Halloween Havoc, I had been being a bit sick on the road, and Halloween Havoc, I was taking bumps and stuff. Medusa was obviously, a very skilled athlete, but I didn't get to mingle so much because she was coming in as I was going out. And I remember Halloween Havoc, to have to be careful not to take any bumps because I was already pregnant. And so, but I got along with everybody, to be honest.
And the book points out, I always wonder as a kid, because I was like, wow, who's that? It's Lady Blossom. And then you were gone. And I was like, what happened to her? And of course, the book points out, you left when you became pregnant with your second child, your first child with Steve. And the book also goes into detail about the evolution of your relationship with Steve, as well as if anyone out there wants to hear stories of a difficult mother-in-law, this is definitely the book for you. But how would you explain the evolution of your relationship with Steve, up to this point, when you're pregnant with your first child with him?
Well, I was ecstatic, really. Because I had not actually been written out of the show properly. So I agree with you that nobody knows what happened to me. But in my book, you'll see that my childhood was difficult. I had moved to Los Angeles, and then we up and left there into Portland, and I never had this sort of all my life. I had never had a happy family life. It was either I'm moving about and stuff. And these years from 92 to 96, when my other daughter, Cassidy, was born, were some of the best years because Steve and I had got married. There was some friction between me and his mum, but Steve and I were very, very happy. And this was the first sort of sense to me of having a happy home, and I had enjoyed decorating, and I really enjoyed being a mom and a stay-at-home wife and mom. Steve wasn't gone all the time because center stage wasn't too far away, and it didn't seem like he was gone all the time. And when he came home, we were always together. We did so much fun stuff. We'd play pool, we'd play darts, we'd go to the woods, we'd shoot guns, and we'd go out for dinner. So those were very, very, very happy years that Steve and I spent together. He was a really good dad. We loved to play with the kids. We had a trampoline, and we would, go four-wheeling with the kids and all sorts of fun stuff, swimming. So those years were very, very happy for Steve and I.
And obviously, it's one of the things your book talks about is, as I put it before, the evolution of the relationship. And certainly when things got tough, it affected things. When Steve got injured, when Steve got fired by Eric Bischoff, and when he had that uncertainty, even with Paul Heyman calling him, but that uncertainty of, where's my career going to go and what am I going to do? It definitely put a strain on things, but it seems that the thing that really was the most damaging to the relationship, from my perspective, from reading it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, was moving out of Atlanta and moving back to Texas.
I think so. There was a lot happening at the same time because, yes, he'd gone with Paul Heyman to ECW, and then obviously with WWF at the time, was also the time I was just 8 months pregnant when he came home and said, we're moving. And we also had a big problem with the tax man from a dodgy accountant that, we had a huge amount of money to pay back. So I was heavily pregnant and packing. And also I had a real sense of community there because I had a lot of other interests, a lot of friends, and it was tough all around. And when we, because I was pregnant and Steve would want to move back to Texas, and I could understand on Steve's point of view, don't get me wrong, because he was no longer under contract with WCW and he probably just wanted to go back home, and that's fine. But we did have a happy home there. And I think if we hadn't moved, possibly would still be happy. But what had happened was we'd got to a rental house and all our stuff was still packed. And because of this tax problem, we couldn't buy a house. So actually Vince bought our house for us. And the thing was, though, because I'd now had 3 children and I had postnatal depression, and Cassidy was just a little baby. And Steve went out to pick out a house with his mom, I believe. And then it was like, we're moving here. And this house was like at the end of a really long road on the left. It was like a Spanish hacienda, but it was just rocks and trees and around. And I didn't have any friends. So I got postnatal depression and I'm not happy where I'm living. Possibly the start of me feeling lonely. And on the other hand, with Steve, he had now become stone cold, and he was, a lot of pressure was on him. So, and he was doing a lot of other things. He took up hunting as well, so he could relax. But what happened was, it was like all the stuff Steve and I did together, and I had made this home such a happy home in Atlanta. What had happened was I didn't really see Steve anymore, so I had no friends, and I had trouble fitting in with the friends he made, which I do write about, and so my depression and loneliness, if anything, I would say extreme loneliness, led me to start using anti-anxiety, antidepressants, and Soma and all sorts of stuff, because I think I hated so much how I was feeling that I only started off using a little amount. But as you know, these things tend to be progressive. And with the people that I was living with, I didn't click with. And obviously I had no family, and I wasn't particularly close with Steve's mom. So it was like I was in the middle of nowhere all by myself, very, very lonely, and became dependent on drugs. And I think what happened was that's when Steve and I started to, drift apart a little bit then, and it just got worse and ended up obviously getting a divorce, and I had some major problems with addiction.
And, the book points out, like you said, you're a very friendly person. Hey, I like you. And, we've only been talking for a little while here, but everywhere you've been, you made friends. I mean, everywhere in this book that you go, you make friends. And then you go back to Texas and you're isolated. And I got to tell you, I don't think I've read a book lately where I wanted to punch anyone as much as I wanted to punch those 2 neighbors. I won't even say their names, that you had in Texas. I wanted to punch them. And mind you, I just read a book about the Nixon administration, but I hated them more, these people. And, unfortunately, it causes a lot of problems in the relationship. His reliance on them, his constantly going to them instead of working on the relationship with you. And
exactly what happened, yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, it ends up being a lack of communication. It ends up being a almost a cold distance, the way I read it, from Steve to you during this time. But, around this time, he's unhappy in WWF. He's the ringmaster. It's going nowhere. He's not doing his own interviews. Ted DiBiase is. And he's trying to come up with a new name, and he gets that famous note from the office with names like Ice Dagger and, Chili McGee. And you're the one who came up with the name Stone Cold, as it's well known. And also the other thing was, and I didn't know this, I knew the Stone Cold part. I didn't know that you were the person that put 316 into his head, because you had been active in Atlanta in your church. You got very religious, and that's where he got the idea for what would be Austin 316. Yeah,
what had happened was he had a big wedding to his first wife, Kathy, which I don't think he really was ready to get married at that time. And because, all his family had gone to this massive wedding, when he finally told his mom the day before my baby was due that he was with me, we were going to get, his marriage got annulled, we were going to get married. Basically, they said, we'll just have a small wedding at the house. You can go out and get one of these little it's called a carol little suit, where it's just like a little suit, you know, not a wedding dress per se. And we have a very low-key wedding, just the pastor from the church and maybe his mom as a witness, just nobody really there, just us. So I actually agreed to that. You know, I was like, okay, that's fine. And then what happened was, obviously I went to the church because I obviously didn't know how to get a pastor to come in and get us married. So I went into the church and I said, hi, how you doing? And how do I go about booking you for a wedding at the house? You know, I very seriously asked that question. He's like, whoa, hold on a second. He goes, you know, do you want to come and sit in my office and we'll talk about this and where are you at spiritually? And we usually do a little counseling before the wedding, and you know, we have to go. He wasn't too happy about that. So I went back to the church and I said, well, you know, he's really busy. He's on the road all the time, but hey, I'll come to the counseling. And as I went to the counseling, I was always, you know, open-minded on these sort of things, and I did because I'm a Christian. And one of my favorite hobbies, because I used to have a lot of hobbies then when I was in Atlanta, is I used to go buy plain T-shirts and I would buy paints. You know, I like to design different T-shirts, and because I'd become a Christian via going to the church to talk about him to come to the house to get us married. One of the T-shirts I would do was John 3:16. I would write John in my fabric paints, and then a great big 3:16. And one day, some friends of Steve and I, they said, do you want to go to this Renaissance festival that was in town that was there every year? And I was sure, and I put this T-shirt I made on, which was a big 3:16 on it. And Steve would go, what is that? And what does it mean? And I would say, yeah, well, it's from the Bible and this and that. And that's what I think inspired the 3:16, because I was actively wearing a 3:16 T-shirt for just prior to the Jake the Snake, King of the Ring interview. And I thought he did a great interview, but I was wearing the 3:16 T-shirt, yeah.
You mentioned how Vince helped you guys out when you had tax problems by purchasing your house after Steve had called him about that, which you detail in the book. You know, a lot of good and a lot of bad can be said about Vince McMahon, but it seems that you had really good thoughts and good memories of him in your book, that he really treated you well. Is that correct?
Yeah. You know, I remember the phone call Steve made to him, and he said, hey, you know, could you help me to get a house? And at first Vince said to him, just exactly how much of that firewater you've been drinking when Steve asked that. But he did come through and buy us the home that I hated, and I called the Amityville House of Horror. But Vince owned that house, yeah. But when I was getting quite ill, and around the time when I had the terrible troubles with the neighbours, he did suggest, it was Vince who actually suggested a rehab for me, and that he would have somebody from his office sort that out, which he did. But he gave Steve a week off of work to sort that out. But Steve did look after me during that week, cooking, and he thought I would get better, you know, at the house. But what had happened was that the neighbours then, a week later, to the rehab that Vince had suggested, took me to, against my will, to the rehab, making me be afraid what's going on. And so I took my way out of it. And I admit that, you know, I was like, you know, distrustful of them because I didn't trust them. So I took myself out of it. But I thought that was gracious of Vince to make an offer of the home and the rehab.
Yeah, yes, certainly. And I remember that passage in your book, and there couldn't have been a worse way to usher you into rehab than having these two neighbors who have been awful to you take you, lie to you about where you're going, throw you in the car, ridicule you, and take you there. I mean, out of all the options of getting you to go to rehab, that's the very worst one.
Well, see, maybe they thought I would protest. But they were so cruel to me that when I got to the rehab, I remember the lady, being very nice to me, the worker at the rehab, and they actually said, we can't just, you can't, these two strangers, if not family, if you want, we can't just admit her against her will, because, they were called the police, and then they tried to get me arrested, or the cop to force me in there, and the cop wouldn't do it either. And I think that was really the beginning of the end, because I found that to be such a bad, thing to happen to me, and then them to take the children off of me, and then forcing me to call a lawyer and call the police, and it was a mess. It really got messed up at that point.
Yeah, and I really feel for you for everything you dealt with during that time, with your addiction, and also just this cold environment in Texas, this lonely environment. And, one of the things that I thought was striking in the book was, there's a distance that grows in your relationship with Steve. But then it seems like you guys have that one brief moment where you guys can step back and be the way you formerly were with each other. And unfortunately, that's right after you guys signed the divorce agreement, where you sit down outside and you have that moment together. And, what was it like for you after that? Did you maintain a relationship? I mean, obviously you have daughters together, so there'll always be something there, but did you maintain at that time a relationship with Steve?
Well,
where he was?
See, we got married, we got divorced in the May of 1999. But Deborah and Steve were dating from WrestleMania. So she was there, but I think what had happened is we got divorced, and I went out of the lawyer's office, and I went and I sat on the ground, sort of my back against the wall, and Steve came out and he sat next to me and put his arm around me, and I kind of put my head on his shoulder, and we sat. He said that he thought the business broke us up, and I said, and my addiction, there for a moment we hugged, and it was fine. But after that, unfortunately, Deborah was so jealous, and I'm not being angry to Deborah. She may have her reasons. I don't like, saying anything bad about anybody. But there was a bit of insecurity on her part. And I wouldn't have signed an order to stay in Texas had I not have thought Steve and Deborah would be, and I would have encouraged a relationship with Deborah with my children. But had I thought that wasn't going to work out, I wouldn't have stayed in Texas, because I stayed for the girls to see their dad. But then what happened, because she was so confrontational to Steve, it was hard for me to talk to him. She'd hang the phone up on me and stuff. And I've talked to Deborah since this, like many years ago, but, I've said no problems and that. But it went to be a worsening of my addiction and of me actually having to stay in San Antonio for a year when I'm there living in there, but there's no relationship between Steve, Deborah, and myself and the girls, which was even worse for me. So, I ended up moving to Dallas, and because there wasn't much of a relationship, and Steve himself would say, she'd get really angry if mention of my name, and he did call me up and invite me to a show in Fort Worth, but then he phoned me up again and he said, "Oh, don't come, it's awkward with Deborah." And I, "Oh no, man, I've told the girls that they've made these little signs that you can hold up and what kids do, the little signs, they enjoy doing that." And I was going to just leave the arena, but at least take the girls. So I'm not the heel with the girls, you can't go now. So I didn't want to do that. So I was just going to leave the arena. But I think it was Paul Heyman. He said, "Hey, Jeanie, how you doing? Come on back." And then Deborah storms towards me and gets in my face. And so when I go home after that, Steve phones me up and apologizes. And he said that she took off with the keys of his car. He had to get a ride with her because she was so angry that I showed up with the girls. And I said to her, do you have a problem with my girls seeing their dad? You know, and she just stormed away. And then Chris's parents came over from the UK, and Chris came to visit me at my house. And I had lost hope that anything with the relationship between Steve and Deborah and I and the girls was gonna get any better. So I'm like, I'm living in Texas, and I signed this court order, you know, but now I don't have a relationship with it. Just handing over the girls and them seeing me and their dad, which is what I wanted. And so Jean and Cyril were there, mum and dad, and they were going back to the UK. And because I lost hope, and I was such a bad addict as well, I thought if I went to England, I could possibly get the help I need, because they actually have socialised medicine here. So you can't go to doctor and get, you know, pills whenever you want. So that was initial reason why I came. Then right after I came back, 9/11 happened, you know, with the Twin Towers, and Steve did actually phone me up, and he says, don't get on a plane and don't fly. But the kids needed to go to school, but I didn't hear from Steve for another year after that. It was about a year later. So I put them in school, and we did have some difficult years having communication with the children. That I have spoken to Steve recently, you know, and I've said to him, you know, it's all got messed up, and I just hope that one of the other reasons I wrote my book, we went through the therapeutic process of writing things down and writing about all this stuff, you know, that went on in my life. And one of the big things is that we could put all this behind us. And look, the two beautiful daughters here that need a dad and that need a mom, and it'd be just so nice. You know, it'd be nice if you know, like you see wrestlers' kids go to WrestleMania, you know, and you see Steve there. I mean, you know, maybe Stephanie or Cassidy should go. It'd be really nice for them, or have a Christmas with him, or share a holiday with him or something, you know. So that would be the other result that I would like, just to put all this stuff behind us and say, you know, they're going to get married, or they might have babies. These are events we all want to both be involved in their life, and not to let them be the victims of our mistakes.
Yeah. Has Steve seen the book? And if so, do you know what he's thought of it?
He was the first person to call me to say, hey, you excited about your book? And I said, he said he'd seen an interview of mine, or heard an interview of mine, Wrestling Inc. And he did say to me, look, I didn't know how bad the addictions were. It was all a difficult time for him. He said everything got messed up. And we have sort of been communicating since the book is out. Has he read the book? He said he ordered the book. I don't know if he's read it. He said it should be interesting, and he was going to check it out. And that was about a month or two ago. So possibly he's read it, but he hasn't told me whether he's read it or not.
It's good that he ordered it so he could pay for a copy. That is pretty good. One of the things I said at the top of this interview is you're very, very honest and candid about your addiction and the troubles that you had. And, you know, it's a very touching story because of that, because of your honesty. It's very, very touching. And, you know, I was curious when reading this, you talk about your childhood and issues you had. Your mother had a problem with drinking, and, you know, it affected your childhood. And now that you're sober and you look back, do you see many parallels between your life and your mother's life and the different decisions you guys have made?
I see my mum on a regular basis now. I see the effects of alcohol on her addiction with me, and I can forgive her for anything that happened to me, because I know she wasn't well and she wasn't coping. I have a lot of guilt and shame over my addiction with my children. Obviously, I want to make amends with them. I have a very close relationship with them. I want to point out how an addict not only hurts themselves, they hurt everybody in their life, and addicts can be quite selfish and secretive. They feel like they put their drugs, the need for them, they put that as a priority because they know they're going to get on well, and everything revolves around drugs. And I remember just the Christmas day when I told my children, look, I really need help. I'm serious problem. I hit the point of what they call rock bottom, and all I wanted to do was, make amends with them. But I don't think you have really bad intentions when you're an addict. You're just really unwell. But I don't know the fact. I do feel the guilt that they had to go through so much. But my mum, I would say, I think that I can reflect on her and just say she was in a bad place, and I totally forgive her. I mean, I love my mum and I always will, and I have compassion for addicts as well, so I don't tend to judge people. So I just like to know that maybe somebody could read my book and see what I've been through, and hopefully if they have people who are addicts or know people or the addicts themselves, that they could take something from it and say there's hope for people, that things can get better. And that would be great. If one addict read my book and got better, I'd feel like I accomplished something with that.
Yeah, that would be tremendous. And I certainly do hope that happens. And that's one of the great things about the book is by the end of the book, you're Jeanie again. You're in recovery, you're sober, and it's wonderful and it's uplifting. Looking back now on your life and your career, I'm curious. You had Jeanie's novelty telegrams and you had your run as a manager in the wrestling business. And then we didn't even talk about your brief run as Barney the dinosaur at various kids' parties. But, and by the way, what a missed opportunity there for a Steve Austin match where Barney's in the crowd and all of a sudden comes to the ring and scratches the opponent's eyes and pulls off the head, and it's Lady Blossom all over again. But do you ever miss performing?
Maybe there's times when I think that I have the natural ability to do that, but I'm actually quite happy right now because I'm looking for a home and moving on from that, and I'm doing my very first fan fest. I'm kind of excited about that. Hope people remember me anyway. I'm off to Charlotte in a few days.
Yeah, and people certainly do, and your book will do a good job of making sure people remember you. You're back in England now. How does the England that you live in now compare to the England you grew up in?
I actually really miss the States. I love the States. I really do. And I want to point out that the problems I had in Texas with the neighbors in the small town, I lived in Dallas with Jeannie's, and I love Texas. Just people I'm not, I just had things in that little, little town I was in. But I don't know how England is changed really. I just I would like to have the opportunity to come back to the States. I had some visa problems for a while because I had a green card, because I came home for over a year that I had to abandon it. But I just got a visa just 2 months ago and coming up to LA for Christmas as well with Stephanie. So I'll be back.
Very good. And remember, if you ever need a long-term solution, you could always marry Billy Jack. You can always see what he's up to and see if that offer is still out there. But Jeanie, this has been great talking with you today. And I want to once again point out to all the listeners, the book is Through the Shattered Glass by Jeanie Clarke with Bradley Craig and Neil Cameron. And it is a great read. It's a great read about life, not just professional wrestling. And Jeanie, in closing, is there anything you'd like to say to the people out there who remember you from your various times around wrestling?
I do. After I wrote the book, and I went back on Facebook and not just after, prior to writing the book, and I just felt so much support and love from the fans. And the fans are listening. Thank you for the people that have sent me some great messages and some great reviews on my book. And the fans really mean a lot to me. And I'm excited to meet some fan test at Charlotte next week. So just want to say thank you to the fans.